Donald Trump regularly comments on the term of Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. On his social platform, he has even called him a dictator because Ukraine hasn't held elections. We've been hearing this line for more than a year, straight out of Moscow. That's why Zelenskyy is now being described as an illegitimate president. The usual claim goes like this. Under Ukraine's constitution, if the president's term expires, presidential powers pass to the Speaker of the Verkhovna Rada. But is it really that simple? Is Zelenskyy actually an illegitimate president who made up his own rules, as one of you wrote to me? That's exactly what we're going to break down in this video. Before we look at Ukraine, we must mention a few historical examples from advanced democratic countries, how they solved the same situation. If it does not interest you, you can skip this on the timeline straight to Ukraine. In December 1910, elections were held in Britain in which by one seat the Liberal Party led by Herbert Henry Asquith won. Nobody then knew that elections would not take place in the country for 8 years. According to the plan, they were supposed to take place at the end of 1915, but the Sarajevo shots changed everything. Britain, after the violation of Belgian neutrality, was forced to enter the war as the guarantor of its neutrality. The elections were therefore postponed, which the whole society accepted without problems, and the elections took place only in November 1918. Similarly, France approached it as well, in which elections took place shortly before the outbreak of the conflict. In the May elections in 1914, the Republican, Radical, and Radical Socialist Party won, and René Viviani became prime minister, when the president was only a symbolic figure. The elections were supposed to take place in the first half of 1918, but they took place only in November 1919. The country was partly occupied, it had millions of internal refugees who could not vote in their districts, and it was gradually necessary to demobilize soldiers as well. The country needed time so that people returned to previously occupied territories, and soldiers returned home, so that the results of the elections were relevant. The same happened also during the Second World War. Of course, in the case of France, it was clear, but in Britain, the elections took place in November 1935, and the next ones only in July 1945. Voters therefore did not vote for half a generation, and such a Churchill practically had no legitimacy arising from elections. In 1935, Stanley Baldwin formed the government, whom Neville Chamberlain replaced in 1937. In 1940, when new elections were supposed to take place, he was replaced by Winston Churchill, as a compromise candidate whom even the opposition accepted. Still in 1935, when elections took place, he was considered an outcast with relatively low popularity and with the label of a warmonger because he constantly demanded increasing defense spending and criticized concessions to Germany and the weak reaction to aggressive steps of Italy. If he had been the leader of the Conservatives, then he would most likely have led the party to a crushing defeat. Today, however, almost the whole world considers him a hero when he stood up against an Austrian painter and refused to capitulate or negotiate peace with him. In more recent history, there was a postponement of elections, for example in Israel in 1973, even though it was only in the order of weeks. The elections were supposed to take place on October 30th, 1973, but on the 6th Egyptian and Syrian forces attacked it. They eventually had to capitulate on October 26th, but elections ultimately took place on the last day of that year. To organize elections during an ongoing war conflict is not the happiest decision for several reasons. The first, and probably the most logical, is the division of society. Elections, the democratic ones of course, naturally lead to conflicts and division of society, which in peacetime is healthy for a country if it happens in a reasonable measure. During war, however, it could seriously disrupt the war effort, as a result of which the country could fall apart from within. With that also logically relate to influence operations today fashionably called disinformation campaigns. A hostile power can use the election process to break the war effort, which will allow it, if not to win, then at least to conquer a substantial part of territory until society consolidates. The democratic process could deepen also splits in the army, because soldiers could divide according to political preferences. As a result of mobilization, they are also deprived of the right to seek mandates. People also cannot freely assemble either because they are displaced or for safety, so that a rocket or drone does not hit a gathering of thousands of people. That applies also to the safety of polling stations. Nobody guarantees that they will not become targets of bombardment. Even if, according to some, there is no war in Kiev, a drone or rocket can fall also in Uzhhorod. Russia can quite by accident send a few greetings to polling stations and claim it was not aimed there, and it was only a mistake. It can intimidate people. Only few will come nationwide. And then it will argue low legitimacy because only 10% voted for him. In the Ukrainian case, Zelenskyy can again, under a false flag attack, or declare an air raid alert in places where the opposition candidate would have the advantage. In war, elections can be falsified relatively easily. There is also censorship, which is a normal part of the functioning of a country during war, and it is nothing against democracy. It also applied in Britain. It would not be hard to misuse it against the opposition. But even without this intention, candidates could not openly talk about many topics: economy, industrial, and agricultural policy, etc. Because publicly, this information in wartime must be censored or handled creatively, so that the enemy does not get from the media real information about the state of the country against which it fights. It must use intelligence services, which is more complicated and often less accurate if counterintelligence works well. The example of Britain in the Second World War is ideal. Citizens can also lack documents. They can have permanent residence in occupied territories, which makes it impossible for them to vote. Of course, in presidential elections, it is solvable a bit better than in parliamentary ones. A change of political leadership during war is very problematic. Can you imagine how leadership would change in this situation? A new president and government would first have to familiarize themselves with the situation, find out how things work, and so on, which the enemy would understandably try to use for an attack to which the new leadership would not be able to react adequately and in time. Now, we will explain the situation in Ukraine. You who say that the competences of the president of Ukraine pass after the end of his mandate to the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada are telling the truth. But it applies only in peacetime, respectively when martial law is not declared. If the president during the 5-year term died, resigned, was removed, elections could not be organized in the regular term, or they would have to be repeated. Then indeed the chairman, note not the whole Verkhovna Rada, temporarily gains his competences. But if a situation occurs requiring declaring martial law or a war conflict occurs, then the term of parliament and the head of state is automatically extended until it is possible to ensure holding democratic and fair elections while ensuring the safety of voters. Therefore, during this state, Zelenskyy's mandate could not expire because it is extended until the end of the war conflict. After it ends, elections must be organized in the shortest possible time, which can be a few weeks but also months, as historical examples show. Britain was not hit by war in the First World War in such a way, so elections were organized practically a few days after the signing of the armistice and in the Second World War, a few weeks after the end of the war in Europe, because already for several months the country was in relative safety. France took after the end of the First World War to organize elections a year because fighting took place on its territory, and also Alsace and Lorraine were liberated. After the second, it took half a year, and after another half a year, they were held. Zelenskyy did not invent his own rules or laws as it is written on the internet or in alternative media, but paradoxically, he respects the valid laws of his country. Therefore, please do not spread nonsense about Dictator Zelenskyy, or do not talk about him as an illegitimate president because it is not true. Of course, for now, because I cannot claim it 100%, because I do not see the future how he will behave after the war. If after the signing of peace or a ceasefire, such as prevails for example in Korea, since 1953 he does not organize elections even within 2 years, I will talk about him as an illegitimate head of state or a dictator as well, or if he organizes them in the style of Putin or Lukashenko. Until then, he is a properly elected democratic president. In the community card, a poll is waiting for you on this topic, and do not forget that in polls, Volodymyr Zelenskyy leads, who considers Zelenskyy still a more moderate candidate who, by delaying mobilization for political reasons, perhaps lost the country the war. It could paradoxically escalate the situation even more. If you liked the video, I will be glad for a like, comment, sharing, and if you like my work, I will be glad if you become a member of the channel, whom I would like to thank very much for their support. And it will also please me if you subscribe with the bell turned on, and we will hear each other at the next video. I wish you a nice rest of the day or night.